Hi, this is Mr. Murray, and you are listening to the first of what will eventually be several, I'm not exactly sure how many, but several Heart of Darkness podcasts. The reason I'm making these podcasts is because it's impossible to cover everything in the text in class in the detail that I would like to. That having been said, I'm not going to talk about every single thing in the text in the podcasts, otherwise they'd be way too long. But it will allow us to look at a few things that we might not have otherwise had time to look at. It's also a way for me to kind of model annotating and analysing extracts, because what you'll be able to do is have a highlighter and a pen in hand, and if you don't have one, you should pause now and go and get one along with your copy of the book. And as I'm talking, you'll be able to add your own notes and annotations to your copy of the text. The last few years I've done podcasts for the texts that we've studied, and all the students without fail have said that the thing that they've found most helpful and that they feel have improved their marks the most have been the podcasts. One comment that I will make is that listening to the podcasts is not a substitute for reading the text. Obviously you need to read and reread and reread again the texts to know them really, really well. A minor issue will arise here because I'll refer to page numbers from the Penguin Classics edition, and I know not all of you are using that. So what I'll also try to do is indicate which paragraphs we're looking at for the people who don't have the Penguin Classics edition. The podcast should still be totally fine for you though. You just might have to pause and hunt around in your book a little bit more, and I do apologise to you for that. So just going to start on the first page of the text, which in the Penguin Classics edition is page 3. I'm not sure how long this podcast will go for, but we'll see. So it opens, of course, on the Nelly, as we can see there, and straight up there's a couple of things that I think are important in that very, very, very first paragraph. One being that the term is used, the only thing for it was to come to and wait for the turn of the tide. And when Conrad writes the only thing for it, he's saying there is no option for these men but to wait for the tide to turn. They can't do anything until that happens. And that suggests that these men, like all of us, are at nature's whim. Nature has complete control of this situation, as it does over many situations. They can't sail when they choose. They are forced to sail when the tide changes. Another way we can look at this is men waiting for the turn of the tide, in a way, is a symbol in itself of people waiting for change, because the turn of the tide can be seen as a symbol of change. And there are so many things that Conrad's critical of in this text that we can almost step back and look at him as an author and say, here is a man who is waiting for social change and change in the way that Europeans are behaving in Africa. And what other reason would there be for him to write this text, arguably, than to horrify people sufficiently that people might get angry and things might change. In the next paragraph, the one that begins with the words "the sea reach of the Thames," there's some nice language when he says luminous space. Well, we know luminous is an important word because it is about light and enlightenment. But he talks about red clusters of canvas sharply peaked, and that's interesting language because the colour red and the sharp peaks almost suggest something that is knife-like. The descriptions are quite harsh, and that ominousness is built later in the paragraph when we get the words mournful gloom and brooding. Also importantly in that same paragraph, Conrad writes about a haze rested on the low shores, and haziness like fog and smoke and so forth suggests confusion and the inability to see things, or the inability to fully understand a situation. And as we know, a key element of this text is inscrutability. In other words, not being able to understand things. Marlowe doesn't understand things. His audience don't understand things that he tells them. And ultimately, we as readers are left in a position of ignorance to a degree. Next paragraph after that, it begins the director of companies. And of course, the capitalisation there suggests his importance and links him with notions of commerce and power. And this guy's power is further emphasised by the four who are referred to affectionately watching his back. It's like they're behind him. And in fact, at the end of that paragraph, we get more brooding gloom. So Conrad is really building a tone of ominousness and almost an oppressiveness in these opening passages. Next paragraph begins, between us there was, as I've already said somewhere, the bond of the sea, which we don't need to talk about that too much, but we know Conrad was a man of the sea and liked to sail. And in fact, in that section, we get this first indication that many, many individuals in the text are nameless and are in fact reduced to their roles. We have the lawyer and the accountant. And we could say here that they are reduced to their roles within the domain of commerce. And that's what I've written in my little margin. In other words, who they are as human beings is not important. Making money is prioritised so highly in this society that all that really matters is the part that they play in the whole money-making process. So this guy's a lawyer, this guy's an accountant. We don't need to know anything else. Also, going on to page 4 in the Penguin edition, it says the accountant had brought out already a box of dominoes and was toying architecturally with the bones. Powerful symbolism there that most of you would pick up on, which is the symbolism of life and death being like a game to these people. It's interesting that dominoes sometimes were made of bone and sometimes were made in fact of ivory, and so this guy playing with these quote bones suggests once again that the way in which Africa is perhaps seen as something to toy with. We get descriptions here of Marlowe sat cross-legged right aft, aft meaning at the back of the boat, leaning against the mizzenmast, and a description of Marlowe here, which is important: sunken cheeks, a yellow complexion. We've talked about the fact that yellow literally can mean a person is sick if their liver's not working very well. It also is a symbolic reference to sickness, which we can expand to the sickness of colonialism, and also it aligns with the fact that we have Belgium represented with the colour yellow on the map, and Marlowe has been tainted by that. He's turned yellow, almost like he's gone into this yellow region and it's kind of stuck to him and he can't clean it away. There's really huge amounts that we could talk about here, but in the interests of keeping the podcasts not gigantic, I'll skip some of it. There's a footnote on the comment that describes Marlowe as resembling an idol. You can have a look at that, but it certainly suggests his, I would argue, wisdom as a result of the experience that he's had. Further down in that same little section, we felt meditative and fit for nothing but placid staring. The day was ending in a serenity of still and exquisite brilliance, which is actually a juxtaposition to what we've just seen of Marlowe and some of the awful kind of descriptions of him. But what's really interesting here is that the unnamed narrator's descriptions are quite positive here. So, serenity of still and exquisite brilliance. The water shone pacifically. The sky without a speck was a benign meaning good, immensity of unstained light. And it says the very mist on the Essex marshes was like a Gaussian radiant fabric. So it's actually, there's a huge amount of enlightenment imagery in this section, but it actually is quite positive. And the reason for that is the unnamed narrator hasn't heard Marlowe's horrible story yet. It's through Marlowe that we get the much more negative representations of light, and by the end, the unnamed narrator has been very much changed by this story that he hears from Marlowe, and so his descriptions become much more negative. So one of the changes, just as these men are waiting for the turn of the tide, one of the changes is that which takes place in the unnamed listener, if you want to call him that. What else are we going to talk about? More, in fact, morbid imagery in the next little section. Dull red, gloom without heat, stricken to death, and so forth. Yeah, it's difficult because there's just so much that we could talk about. What does that say? Struggling to read my own handwriting. Okay, so perhaps if we look at a little bit, in the paragraph that begins with the word forthwith, there's a section that said, the old river in its broad reach rested unruffled at the decline of day, after ages of good service done to the race that peopled its banks. The fact that the river has done service to them suggests that these people believe they can control nature. So the river is doing a service to them. It's helping them with their boats and their transportation and helping them, I suppose, fishing, those sorts of things. And later in the story, of course, we learn that nature is something that very much can't be controlled. And the use of the word service here once again suggests, at this stage, the naivety of the listener, because he hasn't been turned around by Marlowe's story yet. But this river, we're told, leads to the uttermost ends of the earth, which reminds us that the civilized world in which we find ourselves here is very much linked with the uncivilized world. So these guys think they're in this civilized place, but they have a connection to these very uncivilized and wild places. And that could be read or could be analysed as a reminder that no matter how civilized we believe that we are, and no matter how much we sort of embrace society and behave in appropriate ways in accordance with society's rules, we still have within us these this id, if you like, to go with what we've talked about in class regarding the Freudian interpretation of the text. So we can sort of draw that out from this little comment. We haven't talked about this too much yet in class, but a bit of sexism here when we say, and indeed nothing is easier for a man who has, as the phrase goes, followed the sea. And this is very much a patriarchal society, in other words, a society that's dominated by men and in which men have all the power. We get unceasing service again, referring to the currents. Served all the men for whom the nation is proud, from Sir Francis Drake to a whole heap of other guys. And the listener to Marlowe's story, or soon to be, speaks about all these things very positively. Geez, we're up to 13 minutes already. This isn't good, because like a page and a half. Anyway, maybe I'll limit this one to 15 minutes. Actually, not 15 minutes. Let's say 30 minutes. It's a good round number. Over the page, so onto page 5, but still in that big long paragraph that begins with the word forthwith, there's some really interesting stuff near the end of the paragraph. Firstly, you've got hunters for gold or pursuers of fame, which suggests once again the superficiality and the greed of Europeans and what they really want. It's not to help indigenous populations in any way, it's just to get stuff for themselves. But we also have the very interesting light reference here, where it says, immediately after that, they all had gone out on that stream, bearing the sword and often the torch, messengers of the might within the land, bearers of a spark from the sacred fire. So it's interesting because on the one hand, spark and fire suggest enlightenment, but they're also very destructive forces, as we see later in the text when there's a few fires actually in this text that cause a lot of damage. So I think we could say here that Conrad is deliberately linking notions of enlightenment with the notions of destruction. And in fact, the word sword prior to that suggests the same thing as well. And in fact, that paragraph ends with seeds of commonwealths, the germs of empires. So just a little hint here with the word germs, because germs has multiple meanings, but one of those meanings, of course, are the little cells. I don't know, some of you are sciencey, you'd know more about it than I do, but germs cause disease and illness. So once again, Conrad having a bit of a slash at the colonialists. The sun set, the dusk fell on the stream, and lights began to appear along the shore. There's reference to a lighthouse, shone strongly, lights of ships, a great stir of lights, lots and lots of repetition of light imagery. Conrad's way of drawing our attention to one of the key themes of the text, which is his critique of elements of enlightenment. And the monstrous town we get here further west on the upper reaches, the place of the monstrous town was still marked ominously on the sky, a brooding gloom in the sunshine, a lurid glare under stars. So that's a very negative representation of a Western city, and it's almost saying the consequences of colonialism, like, look what happens when the Europeans establish themselves. We get this monstrous, brooding place that's giving off this lurid glare. It's all very uncomfortable. Unpleasant's probably a better word for it. And then Marlowe starts. He says, and this also has been one of the dark places of the earth. So he's saying that London, England, once was uncivilized, was unconquered. And this is what kind of gets him thinking about this story that he soon shares, and which runs over the next 90 odd pages of the novella, not the novel, even if I occasionally call it that by mistake. He was the only man of us who still followed the sea. And I'm just going to read a section of that paragraph. It starts a little bit further down where it says, in the immutability of their surroundings, the foreign shores, the foreign faces, the changing immensity of life glide past, veiled not by a sense of mystery, but by a slightly disdainful ignorance. For there is nothing mysterious to a seaman unless it be the sea itself, which is the mistress of his existence and as inscrutable as destiny. A whole heap of things we could say about that passage, but I'm just going to mention a few. Firstly, it has a wave-like rhythm, and it is interesting because Conrad is writing about the sea at the same time as he's constructing a sentence that has a wave-like rhythm. And you can identify things like that because it highlights that you understand Conrad is a very intelligent guy and is writing in very interesting ways deliberately. A bit like that other bit that we looked at in class where he's talking about a winding, twisting path, and the sentence itself becomes a kind of winding, twisting path. The sea is referred to as a mistress, so again we have gender here and hints of the way in which Marlowe and arguably Conrad perceive gender. Women get arguably a pretty poor run in this text. But anyway, we'll talk about that more at another time. And also inscrutability is referenced. So already, as early as the first few pages, Conrad is saying there's a lot of confusion and mystery in this text. And we should prepare ourselves for that. I'm turning the page to page 6. There is a paragraph there that ends with the word moonshine. It might even be that same paragraph from before. I'm too lazy to turn the page back and check. But I've highlighted a bit that says, to him, the meaning of an episode was not inside like a kernel, but outside, enveloping the tale, which brought it out only as a glow brings out a haze. So there's more light imagery, but also more references to inscrutability, because when he says the meaning of an episode was not inside, what he's essentially saying is the meaning or the solution is not contained within things. So for instance, the meaning or the solution is not within the text, but is actually outside the text. It's perhaps within us as readers to think about and interpret, because for Conrad, it's too easy to just say, I mean, the text would be way, way worse, I would argue, if at the end Marlowe said, I figured out what the horror meant, what he meant was, and then answered it. That's not how Conrad writes, and we're told quite early on not to expect that kind of thing. The meaning is not inside, it's outside. It's floating away out in the ether somewhere, and it's for us to figure out what it is. Then we get a very short paragraph there, and then a longer one begins. I was thinking of very old times when the Romans first came here, 1900 years ago, the other day. We get light reference again, even more a little bit further down when he says, we live in the flicker, but darkness was here yesterday. Further down towards the bottom of page 6, here and there a military camp lost in a wilderness, like a needle in a bundle of hay, cold, fog, tempest, disease, exile and death. They must have been dying like flies here. So morbid imagery, we can describe that as morbid imagery. We get a lot of morbid imagery in this text. Over onto page 7, still the big long paragraph that begins with, I was thinking of very old times. We have land in a swamp march through the woods, and in some inland post feel the savagery, the utter savagery had closed round him. All that mysterious life of the wilderness that stirs in the forests, in the jungles, in the hearts of wild men. So the hearts of wild men, a really interesting quote, because it sort of foreshadows or alludes to Kurtz in a way, because although he's very intelligent, he's not wild in the sense that he's running around yelling and screaming like a madman, but he has disconnected himself from society and from social norms and social rules, and in that sense he is a wild man. There's no initiation either into such mysteries, more clues that there's going to be a heap of stuff in this text we don't understand. He has to live in the midst of the incomprehensible, which is also detestable. So again, I mean, Conrad is banging us over the head, telling us that there's going to be heaps of stuff in here that doesn't get explained. Living in the midst of the incomprehensible. So putting up with the fact that we don't understand things. And it has a fascination too that goes to work upon him. And we see that fascination, of course, in Marlowe for Kurtz. The fascination of the abomination. Abomination being something horrific. And in fact, that section is a good one because it shows Marlowe's confused and conflicted feelings, which he doesn't ever overcome within the text. Now, Conrad here uses deliberately just a 2-word paragraph. He paused, full stop, and then launches into another one, and this shows the shift that is taking place. And Marlowe once again is described, well, he's described as a Buddha. And he says, what saves us is efficiency, the devotion to efficiency, which is basically saying, it's a very, again, Enlightenment way of viewing things. It suggests a scientific perspective, and it calls to mind notions of unfettered commerce and money making, because efficiency, when we talk about efficiency, we're often talking about cash. And then we have reference to colonists and conquerors using brute force. And here we get into the real critique of Enlightenment when he says, your strength is just an accident arising from the weakness of others. In other words, the Europeans aren't strong. They're just in a position to push the Africans around and others. And in case it's not obvious that this is a critique of colonialism, we get it was just robbery with violence, aggravated murder on a great scale, and men going at it blind. Use of the word blind is very interesting because it suggests that these are not enlightened people. They're just going about it without caring, without thinking. And going about it blind also makes us think later on of the old woman who seems to move like a somnambulist, so like she's walking in her sleep. And again, Conrad suggesting that Europeans just aren't thinking about what they're doing. They're doing this awful stuff and yeah, going about it blind, like sleepwalkers. They're not reflecting on it. And perhaps that's one of the big things that Heart of Darkness, when Conrad wrote it, was trying to do. To get people to stop and think, what are we doing in Africa? What are we doing in similar places? And of course, this bit, I mean, it sort of speaks for itself. The conquest of the earth, which mostly means taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much. And we certainly look into it quite a bit in this text. And it finishes by saying, well, just the idea is what redeems it, but the idea is all crap, Conrad believes. The idea that Europeans are helping and enlightening others, it's nonsense. And Marlowe says, something you can set up and bow down before and offer a sacrifice to. So it's almost like enlightenment is a religious ideology for these people. It's almost like a god that they worship, almost like the god of commerce and the god of efficiency, which is really, really weird. 26 minutes. I think I'm going to stop there. I'm certainly, that actually, this podcast has been probably more detailed than the rest will be able to be. Otherwise, in total, the podcasts will go for God knows how many hours. But the next one will pick up at the paragraph that begins, he broke off, which is at the top of page 8. Thank you for listening.